He was 4 when I made my first picture, and I was 26. So we kind of grew up together and spent all those years. And he was just, I can't say enough for him. He was just a heaven for horses. That's where Trigger is.
For decades,
There are some stories that take decades to reach the surface, not because anyone is hiding them, but because the people involved are simply living their lives quietly, far from the spotlight that once surrounded the names they carry. This is one of those stories. It involves America's most beloved cowboy, a little girl born in an Edinburgh air raid shelter during World War II, and a connection between them that traces back to one of the most heartbreaking moments a parent can experience. Once you understand the full picture, the way you think about Roy Rogers, not the icon, but the man, will shift in a way that is entirely permanent. To understand what his daughter confirmed, you first need to understand who Roy Rogers actually was and how high he had climbed before any of this private story began. Roy Rogers was born Leonard Franklin Sly on November 5, 1911, in Cincinnati, Ohio. There was nothing inevitable about his fame. He grew up in modest rural circumstances, and during the Great Depression, he made his way to California. Rogers drove a gravel truck, and then worked as a fruit picker in the same Central California farm camps John Steinbeck wrote about in The Grapes of Wrath. From those campfire evenings, playing guitar came the musical foundation that would eventually carry him to the top of Hollywood's Western genre. He formed a singing group that became the Sons of the Pioneers, caught the attention of Republic Pictures, and was given a new screen name that audiences immediately responded to. Within a few years, he was not just a movie star, he was a cultural institution. Roy Rogers is the only person to be elected twice to the Country Music Hall of Fame. First in 1980 as a member of the original Sons of the Pioneers, and then in 1988 as an individual for his own career achievements. The Roy Rogers Show ran from 1951 to 1957, and his partnership with his wife Dale Evans produced a body of work that reached tens of millions of people every year throughout the 1940s and 1950s. Their theme song, Happy Trails, written by Dale Evans herself, became one of the most recognized pieces of music in American popular culture. Roy Rogers was the king of the cowboys, and that was not a marketing phrase. It was a genuine description of what he meant to a generation of Americans who grew up with his face on their television screens, and his values quietly shaping how they understood right and wrong. But the man behind the white hat was carrying things that the public never fully saw. And to understand the story that his daughter eventually confirmed, you have to start with the marriage that made Roy Rogers' private life what it was. Roy Rogers married Dale Evans on New Year's Eve 1947. The successful marriage was Rogers' second and Evans' fourth. The two were a team on and off screen from 1946 until Rogers' death in 1998. 50 years of marriage in an industry where partnerships rarely last 5. Their first collaboration was the 1944 film, The Cowboy and the Senorita, and the chemistry between them was apparent to audiences and the studio alike. They were not simply co-stars who happened to marry. They were two people who genuinely complemented each other. Rogers with his warmth and steady heroism, Evans with her sharpness, musicality, and a faith that ran through everything she created. That faith would be tested severely and repeatedly. Together they had one child, Robin Elizabeth, in 1950, who died of complications of Down syndrome shortly before her second birthday. Her life inspired Evans to write her bestseller Angel Unaware. Robin's birth had come with complications that, in 1950, the medical establishment was almost entirely unprepared to address with any compassion. Doctors routinely advised parents of children born with Down syndrome to place them in institutions and move on, to keep those children hidden from public view and family photographs alike. Roy and Dale refused. They insisted their daughter be part of their family's public identity at the peak of their fame, against the advice of the studio and against the prevailing cultural attitude of the era. That was not a small decision. That was an act of profound, quiet courage that most people have never fully appreciated. In the best known of her works, Angel Unaware, published in 1953, Dale Evans told the story of Robin, written from the child's perspective, and its impact on how the public thought about children with Down syndrome was enormous. Evans was influential in changing public perceptions of children with developmental disabilities, and served as a role model for many parents. For families who have been told to feel ashamed of their children, the book was a lifeline, a public declaration that those children's lives carried worth, dignity, and meaning. It was Dale Evans turning private grief into something that genuinely changed the world. And it was Robin's death that led, in ways Mimi herself later confirmed, to a 13-year-old girl in Edinburgh getting on a plane to California and starting a life she never could have imagined. Marion Fleming was born in an air raid shelter in Edinburgh in December 1940. From the age of 2, she spent her childhood in a series of children's homes across Scotland. Her parents had not abandoned her out of cruelty. Circumstances during and after the war had made it impossible for family to care for her, but the result was the same: years of institutional life in children's homes across Scotland, without a permanent family or a clear sense of what her future might hold. During his fortnight in Scotland in 1954, Roy Rogers and Dale Evans visited numerous schools and children's homes. When Roy Rogers and Dale Evans visited Dunforth, a Church of Scotland children's home in the north of Edinburgh, Marion stepped forward to sing a song. Roy and Dale were so charmed that they wanted to bring the tiny girl with a fine voice to their home in America. The specifics of that moment say something important about both of them. They were not making a publicity gesture. They were not performing generosity for cameras. They heard a 13-year-old girl sing, and something in them responded in a way that changed the trajectory of her entire life. After a few months and some legal wrangling, Marion spent her first Christmas on their ranch in California as their daughter. Sister Mimi, as she came to be known, joined the family in 1954. Because she was a British citizen, the legal complications of formal adoption were significant. But the Rogers family made clear that the technicalities of paperwork did not define who belonged to their household. Marion Fleming became Mimi Swift, and she later described the transition from an Edinburgh children's home to the California ranch of the most famous cowboy in America with remarkable clarity. When she returned to Scotland in 2019, she said, "What are the chances that they would want me to be part of that family? Part of me thought, it is not going to happen. I was not a cute little 5 or 6-year-old. I was 13. I figured it wasn't going to happen." What Mimi also said, and what sits at the heart of this entire story, is the connection she drew between Robin's death and the family she found herself in. After Robin passed, that's when Mom and Dad got Dodie and Sandy, Mimi told the BBC. She has spoken across multiple interviews about her belief that the grief Roy and Dale carried after losing Robin was what opened their hearts and their home to children who had no family of their own, that the space created by one child's short life became the space that made room for others. For Mimi, the implication was deeply personal. She likely owed her American life, her family, her entire story, to a little girl she never met and who lived for less than 2 years. Evans immediately fell in love with Dodie when she spotted her at Hope Cottage, but it wasn't until Robin's death a few months later that the couple returned to adopt her. By then, Dodie, who is Choctaw, was 7 months old. Then came Sandy, then came Mimi, then came Debbie. Roy and Dale did not simply open their home once. They kept opening it. Rogers and Evans had a total of 9 children together, including biological children, adopted children, and Mimi, whom they fostered and considered fully their own. In an era when blended, multiracial families were genuinely unusual, Roy Rogers and Dale Evans built one, not as a statement, but as a natural expression of who they were. The family they built was not protected from further tragedy, and understanding what they endured makes the warmth they continue to project publicly all the more remarkable. Their adopted daughter Debbie, an orphan they had adopted from Korea, died in a church bus accident. Their son Sandy, who had suffered brain damage due to physical abuse before his adoption, died while serving in the Army. 3 children in total, Robin, Debbie, and Sandy, lost across the span of their lives. 3 times they buried a child, and each time, the Christian faith that ran through everything they did was what held them together, by their own account, when nothing else could have. Mimi said her time on the ranch, "When we were in the house, we were just a family." That sentence is the most revealing thing anyone has ever said about Roy Rogers as a human being rather than an icon. Inside the walls of his home, the king of the cowboys was simply a father, a man who showed up, who created warmth for children who had never had it, and who had no particular reason to expect it. For Mimi, who had spent her early life moving between Scottish children's homes without any certainty about her future, the recognition of that ordinary warmth was anything but ordinary. Roy Rogers died on July 6, 1998, in Apple Valley, California, at the age of 86. The tributes were significant, and the public grief was genuine. Millions of people who had grown up with his face on their screens felt the loss personally. Dale Evans died of congestive heart failure in Apple Valley on February 7, 2001. She was buried next to Roy at Sunset Hills Memorial Park. With both of them gone, the more private dimensions of their family story began to recede from public awareness. The children continued their lives largely outside the spotlight, and the truth of how the Rogers family had actually been shaped, what grief had driven it, what love had sustained it, stayed quietly within the family itself. Mimi Swift passed away in January 2021 at the age of 80 from a brain aneurysm. She had lived long enough to return to Scotland in 2019 for a BBC documentary, to tell her story publicly, to visit the Edinburgh Children's Home where Roy and Dale had found her 6 decades earlier, and to stand in front of cameras and explain, in her own words, what that family had meant to her. The broadcaster who interviewed her for that program described her simply as a really lovely lady. That description, understated as it is, captures something about both who Mimi was and what Roy and Dale had built. Not a performance of love. The real thing, the story that Mimi confirmed across those interviews. That Robin's death was a catalyst for the adoptions that followed. That the grief Roy and Dale carried after losing their only biological child together was what made room for her and Dodie and Sandy and Debbie reframed something that millions of people thought they already understood about the king of the cowboys. The man in the white hat was not simply performing goodness on screen and collecting a paycheck. He and Dale had buried a child, and their response to that loss was to make themselves available to children who needed exactly what they had to give. That is not a small thing. That is a life built on something real. Roy Rogers died 28 years ago. The legend has always been there. What Mimi gave the world, before she left it herself, was a fuller picture of the man behind it.